Hi everyone, welcome to the next lecture of the course, and we will continue our discussion of the story of development of the theory of natural selection. So, we ended our last lecture by discussing two of the three characters that we wanted to, Henry Bates and Alfred Russel Wallace. Today we will talk about Darwin and bring back Wallace and Bates into discussion towards the end of the lecture. Darwin was born in 1809, he came from a rich family, and at 22 he did not really know what to do in life. He was interested in natural life, and in 1832 he got a chance to go on a ship voyage on a ship called HMS Beagle, and the journey was supposed to last 2 years and go around the world collecting samples. His job on the ship was as an amateur naturalist and also to act as the dining maid for the ship's captain Fitzroy. So, in 1832 Darwin goes on this ship called HMS Beagle, which starts from England and eventually makes its way across the Atlantic and makes stopovers along the eastern coast of South America. After going around South America, the journey takes him to Australia, southern tip of Africa, back to the eastern coast of South America and back to England. This whole journey was supposed to last about 2 years. However, as luck would have it, Darwin was seasick and the whole journey lasted for about 5. There were major repercussions on Darwin along this journey, and some of the most insightful observations that he made into natural life and its implications on theory of evolution were made in the early phase of his journey. As the ship was crossing Atlantic, so if you see here on the slide, the map that the HMS Beagle took is shown here. It started from England and made its way past Argentina, all the way around South America, and from there Australia, southern tip of Africa, back to South America and back to England. That is the journey that Darwin took. As the ship was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, Darwin again came from a rich family. He had a state of the art microscope along with him on the journey. And as the ship is making its way through the Atlantic, he is looking at these planktons under his microscope, and these are present in their most resplendent beauty and colors. And Darwin asks himself that why are these organisms of such beautiful colors present in the middle of the sea? Why did God make these species and place them here where there is no one to enjoy them and appreciate their beauty? Because that was the prevalent view, that God made species and they were immutable. The next major influence came at a place called Bahia Blanca on the eastern coast of South America, where Darwin notices that the species which are present in that particular area and the fossil records which are present in that particular area bear a marked resemblance, except for the fact the fossils are of a much larger organism than the ones which are present in that area now. Why does this similarity between organisms that existed in that area in an ancient time, why is there this similarity between them and the present day organisms in that area bewildered Darwin? And from there on, when the ship made its journey across the South American continent and came to this group of islands on the western coast of South America, these Ecuadorian islands which are called Galapagos Islands, which are the very famous ones which I am sure everybody has heard of, is where Darwin made his most remarkable observations. When Darwin went to these closely situated islands in Ecuador which are called Galapagos Islands, Darwin was very seasick. In fact, in one of his notebooks he writes that Galapagos Islands are not very pretty, and he writes that if there was a garden in hell, this would what it would look like. But a couple of curious things happened on the islands. One was that the natives of the islands told Darwin that just by looking at the turtle and the design on its back, they could tell which of the islands had the turtle come from, which means the turtle on each particular island had a slightly different pattern or a design back on its shell. Darwin also noticed that finches were present on every one of these islands, but each island had a finch which was slightly different than the others. The difference was perhaps in the color on the chest, the difference could be in the structure of the beak, or a color associated with right next to the eye, but each of these finches had these very slight differences associated with them. So, a theory begins to take shape in Darwin's mind while he is on his journey, that species are not immutable, but it's the interplay between the environment in which a species is growing and the species itself that species develop and they change over generations. And he thinks that these finches these finches took their particular form based on the exact environment which is associated with one particular island. If two islands had slightly different environments, the finches adapted themselves to best survive those particular environments, and hence that led to the changes which could be seen by everybody around them. That was how Darwin started forming his theory of evolution. Of course, Darwin comes back in 1836 with the ship, and he's still working on the theory associated with his view of evolution. But he's not very certain, and the views are still taking shape in his mind, and he's careful not to make his views public. In fact, one of the best representations of how this theory of natural selection was taking place in his mind can be found from his notebooks page, which he wrote in March 1837, and this is a very iconic picture where he says that species are not immutable, species arise from other species. This change takes place based on the environment that is posed to a particular species, and hence origin of species can best be represented by this tree like structure where one node is one species which gives rise to several other nodes which are other species, and so on and so forth. Each node then further diversifies into more nodes, leading rise to more species in the environment. And Darwin still is in a conjectural mode because he puts this "I think" at the top left corner of his page. However, these are Darwin's private views. He doesn't want to contradict the church at this point, and hence he never makes his theory public except for a very few select group of friends. By 1842, he has written a 35-page note on natural selection, which has grown to more than 200 pages by 1844, but still private. On the other hand, if you look at Darwin's public views on evolution, he really does not go out and conjecture. Privately, he thinks that it's a tree-like structure which best explains rise of species, and that's the question that he's most interested in. Like Wallace, where do species come from? And he thinks species come from species in that tree-like structure. But publicly, Darwin doesn't say that. In his most comprehensive work that summarizes the journey on the Beagle, which is called The Voyage of the Beagle, on the topic of evolution, Darwin doesn't spend any time. He says it is clear, talking of the finches on Galapagos Islands, he says that it is clear that several islands have each their peculiar species of the same genre. When these are placed together, they will have a wide range of character. But there is no space in this work to enter on this curious subject. Of course, so Darwin is sidestepping the issue, the question associated with evolution. This book was published 3 years after his journey in 1839, and Wallace might have read this book and thought to himself that evolution of species is an open question, and was that open question that drove him to Amazon in the 1840s and spent 4 years there collecting samples along with Henry Bates. Okay, so 1852 is when Wallace survives the sea fire and makes it back to England, but in 1853 he is ready to go back to sea again. And before he goes back, he is still interested in the question of where do species come from. And this time he chooses to go to the Malay archipelago, which is the present day Malaysian islands in Southeast Asia. And before he heads over, he goes and meets Darwin, who is the best known naturalist in England at that time, and asks him if he would be interested in following Wallace's work and giving him advice as he goes there to try on his quest of answering where do species come from. Of course, he doesn't know that Darwin already has a possible answer to that question, and Darwin doesn't confide in Wallace and tell him that he's arrived at the question, but Darwin tells him that he would be very interested in following Wallace's work as he goes to the Malay archipelago and collects samples. So the next figure sort of summarizes Wallace's journey. Darwin is still in England, whereas Wallace has gone to the Malay archipelago, which is between Australia and the Asian landmass. He lands there in 1854, and on the bunch of these islands here, he makes about 100 crossings, travels thousands of miles and collects hundreds of thousands of specimens over next 8 years. But the peculiar thing that Wallace notes on this journey of Malaya archipelago is the following, that along the islands he could clearly draw a line between the island, where on all the islands belonging close to Australia, there were the animals that existed were marsupials like kangaroos who carry their young ones in a pouch. Whereas on all the islands that were towards Asian landmass as compared to the Australia, the marsupials did not exist and you had more monkey-like animals present there. In addition, just like Darwin, as he moved from one island to another, Wallace noticed that the design on the butterfly wings had a very peculiar fashion, and that was associated with which island did the butterfly came from. And just as Darwin has formulated his idea of theory of evolution from his journeys and lessons from Galapagos Islands, his experience on the Malaya archipelago shaped the theory of evolution in Wallace's mind. Both Darwin and Wallace were also influenced by an economist called Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus in 1798, as you can see here, has written an essay which was called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And Malthus, who was an economist, his argument was that human and other populations are kept in check by death happening. Overcrowding of an environment does not happen because death takes over, resources become limitation. But what Darwin and Wallace had both noticed was that there is variation that exists in nature everywhere. And this variation is non-random in the sense that only those variations which are best adapted to an environment survive and others perish. But what Malthus was saying, that competition for resources which would lead to death keeps populations in check. And Darwin and Wallace both independently put the two ideas together, leading them to their theory of natural selection. And in 1855, Alfred Russel Wallace wrote this essay which was called On the Law Which Has Regulated the Introduction of New Species. And in this he writes that every species has come into existence coincident both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. Again, he is arguing the same thing which Darwin saw in South America, that species just don't crop up anywhere. Species arise in areas where similar looking species already exist. And independently from Darwin, remember the note that Darwin had in his notebook from 1837, in 1855 Wallace now writes that the best mode of representing the natural arrangement of species is a branching tree, which is just a fascinating example of how two minds working so far away in space and time converge to the same idea on a theory as important as evolution. Of course, when Wallace published this in 1855, his ideas weren't well received and he was sent there, he was financed and sent there to collect specimens and sent back to Europe. And people back in England were basically told him that you just keep collecting samples and keep sending them back to us. So exasperated, Wallace writes his notes, but this time before seeking publication, he sends his ideas across to Darwin. And in his notes are these following lines which are perhaps worth reading. He says, the life of wild animals is a struggle for existence and to provide an infant offspring. That's the struggle that all life forms are going through. Perhaps all of variations must have some definite effect, however slight in the habitats and capacities of the individuals. A variety having slightly increased powers must inevitably in time acquire a superiority in numbers. So what he is saying is that there is variation and each variant is slightly differently adapted to survive and flourish in that environment, and in such a setting the individual which is most suitably adapted to survive and flourish will take over the entire population and eliminate the others. That's the nature of the note that he sends to Darwin. And before we go ahead, it's perhaps best to compare these words of Wallace with something that Darwin had himself written. In chapter 5 of the draft of Origin of Species, Darwin writes, the struggle for existence as bearing on natural selection. All nature is at war. the struggle very often falls on the egg and the seed, or on the seedling, which is survival of the offspring, which is what Wallace is talking about here. Any variation, however infinitely slight, which is again something that Wallace is talking about, having slightly increased powers, if it did promote during any part of life, even in the slightest degree, the welfare of the being, such variation would tend to be preserved or selected. Again, almost identical ideas obtained written around the same time, but developed far away in space and time. Wallace sends his note to Darwin and says that this is how I think species evolved. And Darwin, who has had this theory in mind since the late 1930s, reads it in the 1850s, and realizes that this independently, the same thought independently has also been arrived at by Alfred Wallace. And he hasn't shared his theory with so many people. So what he does is he shares the note that Wallace sends him with a couple of his friends who had already known that Darwin had arrived at this theory way back in time, and asks them what to do. And the friends then suggest that Wallace and Darwin be given equal credit for this discovery, and their papers be read jointly in a conference proceedings around that time. And those friends, if we look at this slide here, this is an interesting slide this summarizes a letter from Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, and Joseph Hooker, who was a botanist. And this is the letter that they write to the president of the Linnean Society, where they are proposing that the work from Darwin and Wallace has been independently arrived at by both these people, and that their work should be admitted as independent contributions. And it's worth reading the first paragraph, which says, "The accompanying papers, which we have the honor of communicating to the Linnean Society, and which all relate to the same subject, viz., the laws which affect the production of varieties, races and species, contain the results of investigations of two indefatigable naturalists, Mr. Charles Darwin and Mr. Alfred Wallace. These gentlemen, having independently and unknown to one another, conceived the very same ingenious theory to account for the appearance and perpetuations of varieties and of specific forms on our planet, may both fairly claim the merit of being original thinkers in this important line of inquiry." Lyell and Hooker go on to request that neither of them have communicated their ideas publicly, and it would only be fair if their works are read on the meeting of the annual Linnean Society. The reading does take place. Neither Darwin nor Wallace could attend that meeting. Wallace was of course away in the Malay archipelago, and Darwin was grieving the death of his child, which had only happened a few days back. The works were read, but they didn't really cause a stir, and the society president, in his notes for the meeting, later wrote that nothing of significance was reported in this year's Linnean Society. So this is how the theory of evolution progressed. Of course, the following year, the year after the reading, Darwin quickly comprised together his book Origin of Species, published it in 1859, and that's a book that's been in print ever since. The book also makes Darwin an enemy of the church, and he faces ridicule from many quarters about proposing a theory of evolution which does not invoke God. In the meantime, 1857 is when Henry Bates, who had gone together to the Amazon along with Alfred Wallace in 1848, comes back and writes to Darwin, "I think I have a glimpse into the laboratory where nature manufactures her new species." So what he is suggesting to Darwin is that I have an example for you where natural selection, your theory of natural selection or the survival of the fittest, can be seen to work, and Darwin is thrilled at the news because he is being attacked, and what he really needs is an example of where this theory is seen evident in playing itself out in nature. And the example that Bates is talking about is one of Bates, what is commonly known as Batesian mimicry. And what Bates has noticed is the fact in the Amazon is the fact that some butterflies were poisonous, so the predators wouldn't touch these butterflies. And of course, these butterflies, because they were not being eaten up by predators, their numbers grew. But some of the what happened as a result was some of the species which were non-poisonous, some of the non-poisonous species of butterflies also acquired characteristics, also evolved to look physically similar to the ones which were poisonous in nature, hoping that the predator would look at them, consider them as poisonous species and not eat them up. And hence this is referred to as Batesian mimicry and was considered an example of natural selection playing into action, where a random variation where one of the non-poisonous butterfly species acquired a mutation to look somewhat similar to the poisonous species of butterflies and hence thrived in number because predators wouldn't touch it now. So, and then it goes on to say, to exist at all in a given locality, she must wear a certain dress, and those of its variety that do not come up to the mark are rigidly sacrificed. I believe the case offers a most beautiful proof of the theory of natural selection, Bates summarizes. Darwin reads the work and says that, in my opinion, it's one of the most remarkable and admirable papers that I have ever read in my life. So that sort of brings us to the closure of the story of these three men, which led to the development of theory of natural selection. If you look at this slide, this summarizes the three most famous work by these people. Darwin published tens of books in his life. He eventually passed away in 1882, but he is of course most well known for his 1859, The Origin of Species. Alfred Wallace only wrote one book in his life, 1889, which he called Darwinism. This was 7 years after Darwin had died. And of course, when the proposal was put forward by Hooker and Lill that a joint reading be done and both authors, Wallace and Darwin, be given equal credit for natural selection, there was no animosity and both were very generous in sharing credit with each other. Wallace always acknowledged that Darwin had arrived at the answer independently and way ahead of when Wallace eventually did. And Bates is most well known for his book, The Naturalist on River Amazons, which he published a few years after his return from the Amazon. So that brings us to a more recent question of what does the tree of life look like, which both Darwin and Wallace referred to. In this first slide is a picture taken from Carl Voss's life, which represents the tree of life like this. The text is too small to read, but essentially what it's showing is that on the left here are all the species which are bacteria, in the center is archaea, and on the right are all the eukaryotes. So this is all complex life. And Carl Voss is famous for his discovery that there are actually three divisions of life and not two as previously thought. So this was more contemporary. However, this is a cover slide that I took from the New Scientist cover from 2009, where it says Darwin was wrong. And why the magazine implies that Darwin was wrong is because when we anticipate DNA changes taking place, sequence changes taking place, we anticipate that the changes take place from one generation to the next generation. As it passes from one generation to next, some mutations, some form of changes would take place and then changes would happen. However, this was the time when it was being discovered that among bacteria, a lot of DNA exchange takes place not from one generation to another, but between two existing bacteria also. This form of DNA exchange is not vertical in nature in the sense that it's not from one generation handed over to the next generation, but is horizontal in nature in the sense that it's between DNA exchange between one existing individual of a species and another. So this is horizontal gene transfer, which led to the New Scientist proposing that Darwin was wrong. More recently, however, the tree of life has taken another shape, and this is a picture that's taken from a 2009 article written by Bill Martin at Dusseldorf, where again this is too small to read, but this is all bacteria, this is all archaea, and somehow somewhere down the line, as we saw around about 2 billion years back or so, an archaea and a bacterial cell combined. An archaic cell engulfed a bacterial cell. That bacterial cell then that bacteria then shed most of its DNA, eventually became a mitochondria, and this mitochondria powered this new cell, and out of that arose all cellular complexity. So the new tree of life has now these three divisions of life, archaea, bacteria, both coming together to form the first eukaryotic cell, and that eukaryotic cell developing into multicellularity and all complex life as we see it today. Of course, Darwin and Wallace and Bates or anybody at that time did not know. They understood that there were changes taking place from species to species, from generation to generation in a species, and as you move forward in time, a species adapted to its environment. But the mode of change, the mechanism by which this change happened was unknown to them. Of course, the first evidence that came towards that end came from Gregor Mendel in 1865, where he famously worked with his pea plants and published data which suggested that there was a certain mechanistic detail, certain mathematics associated with how this information is passed on. Mendel's work after publication remained largely unknown or unnoticed. One of the reasons was that it involved a lot of math until it was rediscovered in 1900 by three people independently. And that sort of set into motion quantitative and statistical development of biological and evolutionary processes. So what I hope to have talked about in these two lectures is given you some historical perspective about where did theory of natural selection and where did start of association of statistics and mathematics with biology came into being. Next lecture onwards, we will start with the first subject associated with our course, which is development of equations for the three basic pillars of evolution: reproduction, selection and mutation. Thank you.